The sound of crunching metal and shattered glass is something you never forget. It echoes in your skull long after the sirens fade. I lay in the sterile emergency room bed, gasping for air through 3 broken ribs. Every breath felt like swallowing crushed glass. I begged the nurse, a kind man named David, to keep trying their numbers. I stared at my cracked phone screen. 21 missed calls. 21 times I reached out while convinced I was taking my last breath. No one answered. Then a notification lit up the shattered glass. It was an Instagram story from my older sister Brittany. The photo showed her, my parents, and her husband Malik clinking mimosa glasses. The caption read, "Best parents ever. Sunday brunch is the best." The location tag felt like a physical blow. They were at Le Petit restaurant exactly 2 miles away from the hospital where I was bleeding out. Fast forward 3 weeks. My phone rang with an unknown number. It was David from the emergency room. He said he had found something on the hospital dispatch system, a recording of the night they ignored my calls. He told me I needed to hear it. The sound that escaped my lips after listening to that audio was not a cry. It was the cold, hollow breath of a woman who realized she had no family left. My name is Savannah, 33 years old, and until that moment I thought being the family scapegoat was just my burden to bear. I worked quietly, dressed simply, and let them think I was just a lowly bookkeeper struggling to get by. I never told them that I was actually the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, a venture capital firm managing hundreds of millions of dollars. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized the people sharing your blood are actually your biggest enemies. The day the hospital discharged me, I had to order my own rideshare. My apartment keys were lost in the wreckage of my car, so I had no choice but to head to my parents' sprawling suburban estate. Every bump in the road sent agony shooting through my chest. I hobbled up their grand driveway, leaning heavily on a cane, my torso tightly wrapped in medical bandages. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door, expecting at least a modicum of sympathy. There was no rush of footsteps, no sighs of relief that I was alive. Instead, my father Richard stood in the foyer, his face twisted in severe annoyance. He glared at my bruised face and immediately shushed me. He said I was making too much noise and ruining Malik's concentration. Malik is my 36-year-old African-American brother-in-law. He is smooth-talking, impeccably dressed in custom suits and always wearing a heavy gold Rolex. He claims to be a tech startup visionary. Right then, he was in the living room practicing a pitch for a massive investment. My mother, Linda, hurried out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an expensive linen towel. She did not ask about my broken ribs. She did not ask about the car crash. She crossed her arms and told me I was being overly dramatic over a minor fender bender. She explicitly told me not to bring my failure energy into the house because Malik was preparing for the biggest meeting of his life. He was pitching a $5 million funding round to Vanguard Holdings. I stood there tasting copper in my mouth from a healing cut on my cheek. I looked at my mother and asked how they could ignore 21 emergency calls when the doctors thought my lung was going to collapse. Brittany sauntered down the curved staircase. She was wearing a new designer outfit and carrying a luxury bag that cost more than a reliable used car. She rolled her eyes and sighed loudly. She said they were busy enjoying their weekend and had their phones on silent. Then she accused me of constantly trying to play the victim just to steal the spotlight from her successful husband. Malik strolled into the foyer, holding a thick stack of financial documents. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply shoved a pen toward me and slapped the paperwork onto the entryway table. He demanded that I co-sign a high-interest bridge loan for his company. He looked me up and down with absolute disgust. He said I was 33, unmarried, childless, and stuck in a dead-end bookkeeping job. He claimed the only useful thing about my pathetic existence was my blank credit history. He ordered me to put my name on the debt, promising that once Vanguard Holdings transferred the $5 million to his account, he would toss me a few grand so I could take a cheap vacation and stop bothering them. Linda chimed in, demanding I do this small favor for the family. She said Malik was destined for greatness, and I should be grateful for the chance to be useful to someone important. Richard added that if I refused to help the family, I could pack my bags and recover on the streets. I looked at the three of them, then at Malik's smug smile. I quietly placed the pen back on the table. I told them I would not sign away my financial future for a failing startup. Before they could start screaming, I turned around and painfully pulled myself up the stairs to my childhood bedroom. I locked the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled my laptop from my bag. The facial recognition scanned my bruised face. The screen unlocked, displaying a highly secure dashboard. A bold greeting appeared across the top. Welcome, founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I opened my pending investment inbox. Right at the very top, flagged for priority review, was Malik's desperate plea for $5 million. I spent the next few hours doing what I do best. I bypassed his glossy presentation slides and dug straight into the raw financial data of his company. It did not take long for the shiny facade to crumble. Malik's startup was nothing but an empty shell. The company was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. He was not paying developers or engineers. Instead, the money was being funneled into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was treating investor capital like his personal piggy bank to fund luxury cars, excessive parties, and extremely expensive gifts. But the most sickening discovery came when I looked at the collateral he had listed for his current debts. He had leveraged a massive secondary mortgage. The property listed was the very house I was sitting in. Richard and Linda had secretly mortgaged their entire retirement and their family home just to fund Malik's fake empire and Brittany's shopping addiction. They had literally bet their entire lives on a con artist while treating their own flesh and blood like garbage. I sat in the dark room absorbing the magnitude of their foolishness. They thought I was a nobody. They thought they held all the power. My phone suddenly vibrated against the wooden desk. It was an incoming call from David, the nurse from the emergency room. I answered the phone, unaware that the audio file he was about to send me would completely destroy any remaining shred of mercy I had left for my family. I answered the phone with my good hand, wincing as the movement pulled at my fractured ribs. David sounded out of breath, as if he had run to a quiet corner of the hospital just to make this call. He asked if I was alone and safe. I told him I was locked in my bedroom. He exhaled heavily and explained that he was breaking several hospital protocols by reaching out to me. He said his conscience simply would not let him sleep. David explained that every single call made from the emergency room dispatch center was automatically recorded for liability and training purposes. When they brought me in bleeding and gasping for air, he had dialed the emergency contact number I provided. He had called my father. David told me the line had actually connected on the very first try. They did not miss my call. They chose to ignore the subsequent 20 times I begged for them. David said he had emailed an encrypted audio file to my personal address. He advised me to listen to it carefully, wished me luck, and hung up before I could even say thank you. I opened my email. The file was sitting right there, a small digital package containing the absolute destruction of my family. I pressed play. The audio was crisp. I could hear the distinct background noise of a busy upscale restaurant, the smooth jazz music playing through the ceiling speakers, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. Then David's voice came through the recording, maintaining a steady professional tone. He identified himself as a trauma nurse and stated clearly that I had been in a severe car accident. He informed my father that I had multiple broken ribs, a potential punctured lung, and that they needed family present immediately to consent to emergency procedures if my condition worsened. There was a brief pause on the recording. I could hear the rustling of fabric as if my father had covered the microphone with his hand, but he did not cover it well enough. His voice leaked through the speakers, dripping with absolute contempt. He groaned and muttered to my mother. He said it was just Savannah throwing another desperate tantrum to ruin Brittany's special day. He told her I was probably faking an injury just to steal the attention away from Malik's business success. David's voice returned to the line, urgently repeating that this was not a drill and my life was in actual danger. My father uncovered the microphone and let out a long, irritated sigh directly into the receiver. "Look," he said, his voice flat and annoyed. "She can wait. We are literally about to order our entrees." I sat completely frozen on the edge of my bed. The pain in my chest suddenly vanished, swallowed whole by a freezing, numbing shock. But the recording was not over. Before my father could end the call, Brittany's sharp, entitled voice cut through the background noise. She yelled across the restaurant table loud enough for the emergency dispatch microphone to catch every single syllable. "Dad, wait," she said, her tone entirely casual. "If she actually dies in there, does her life insurance and savings account go to me? I really need the cash for that new Tesla." My father chuckled, a low, approving sound. Then the line went dead. The audio file stopped playing. The silence in my bedroom was deafening. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not shatter my phone against the wall. The wounded, desperate daughter inside me died right then and there. She took her last breath and disappeared forever. In her place, a completely different woman emerged. A cold, calculating apex predator who had just been handed the keys to her own cage. For 33 years I had craved their love. I had accepted their insults, their dismissals, their blatant favoritism. I had let them treat me like an invisible peasant while they paraded around playing wealthy socialites. They thought my life was worth less than a Sunday brunch menu. They were actively hoping for my death to fund a luxury vehicle. I slowly closed the audio file and opened my corporate directory. I bypassed my usual contacts and dialed the direct unlisted cell phone number of Harrison, the chief legal officer for Vanguard Holdings. Harrison was a ruthless corporate attorney who charged $2,000 an hour. He answered on the second ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him to pull up the $5 million funding request for Malik's tech startup. Harrison pulled the file and noted the extreme lack of liquidity and highly questionable offshore wire transfers. He immediately advised against the investment, calling it a blatant financial sinkhole. I told him I completely agreed. Then I gave him a direct order that made him pause. I instructed Harrison to approve the $5 million funding immediately. But I told him to embed a poison pill clause deep within the legal jargon of the contract. I wanted an ironclad, non-negotiable stipulation regarding personal liability. I commanded him to write the contract so that the absolute second any financial fraud, embezzlement, or offshore diversion was detected, Vanguard Holdings would automatically secure the legal right to seize all corporate and personal assets attached to the guarantor. Harrison asked if I was certain. He warned me that this specific legal trap would completely bypass corporate bankruptcy protections. It meant Vanguard would immediately possess the deed to the suburban mansion my parents had foolishly used as collateral. It meant Malik would face federal wire fraud charges and my parents would be thrown onto the street with absolutely nothing. I looked at the bruising across my ribs. I thought about the clinking champagne glasses while I was bleeding on a hospital gurney. I told Harrison I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I authorized the contract and hit send. I sat in the dark and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Suddenly, an explosive, roaring cheer erupted from the living room directly beneath my feet. Malik was screaming at the top of his lungs. I could hear Brittany shrieking in delight and my mother clapping her hands wildly. My father yelled that they were finally going to be rich. They were celebrating their grand victory. Malik had received the email. He had seen the $5 million approval and blindly signed the digital contract without reading a single page of the terms and conditions. I leaned back against my pillows and smiled into the darkness. The trap had snapped shut. They had just happily signed away their entire existence to the daughter they left to die. A heavy stack of legal documents slapped against the pristine glass surface of the living room coffee table. The sharp, sudden crack echoed through the vaulted ceilings of my parents' suburban estate, jarring my fractured ribs and sending a fresh wave of agony across my chest. I stood there, leaning heavily against the back of a leather armchair, trying to catch my breath after the nightmare of the emergency room. No one offered me a glass of water. No one offered me an ice pack or a painkiller. They did not even ask if the doctors had cleared me to walk. Instead, my brother-in-law Malik stepped into my line of sight. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, flashing a heavy gold Rolex that caught the afternoon light. He looked me up and down, his dark eyes sweeping over my blood-stained shirt and the thick medical bandages wrapping my torso. There was not a single ounce of empathy in his expression. There was only the calculated, impatient glare of a man whose performance had been interrupted. Malik picked up a solid gold pen from the table and held it out to me like he was offering a bone to a starving stray dog. He tapped the thick stack of papers with his knuckles. "It is a short-term bridge loan, Savannah," he said, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced arrogance. "Just a temporary liquidity measure for my tech startup. My primary capital is currently tied up in aggressive growth acquisitions, and I need a secondary guarantor to release these funds by close of business today." I stared at the paperwork. Even through the haze of physical pain, my financial instincts immediately recognized the desperate reality hiding behind his corporate buzzwords. A bridge loan with a secondary guarantor meant his own credit was completely ruined. It meant banks considered him a massive liability. It meant he was flat broke and drowning in debt. "I need someone with a pristine, untouched credit score," Malik continued, pacing slowly across the expensive Persian rug. "And since you never do anything with your life, your credit profile is practically a blank slate. You have zero mortgages, zero corporate debt, and zero actual assets. You just sit in your tiny apartment hoarding your little bookkeeping paychecks. For once in your life, your total lack of ambition is actually useful to this family." I tasted copper in my mouth from a cut on my inner cheek. I looked from the gold pen in his hand to his smug, self-satisfied smile. He was asking me to legally bind myself to a high-interest corporate debt, risking my entire financial identity to fund a company that was clearly bleeding cash. "You want me to sign a blind guarantee for a commercial loan while I am standing here bleeding?" I said, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. Malik scoffed, rolling his eyes as if my injuries were nothing more than a mild inconvenience to his busy schedule. "Oh, please drop the dramatic victim act, Savannah. You got into a minor fender bender. You are fine. You are 33 years old, single, absolutely childless, and barely surviving on a mediocre salary. What exactly are you protecting your credit score for? You are not buying a mansion anytime soon. You are not building an empire. You are just existing." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, his expensive cologne failing to mask the distinct scent of sheer financial desperation. "Sign the papers, Savannah," he demanded, dropping the gold pen directly on top of the signature line. "Look at it as an investment in your own sister's happiness. My company is currently in the final stages of closing a massive Series A funding round. Vanguard Holdings is about to inject $5 million straight into my operating account. The deal is basically done. Once that Vanguard money hits my ledger next week, this bridge loan gets wiped out completely. When the ink dries on that $5 million, I will personally throw a few $1,000s your way. You can finally take a cheap vacation somewhere and get out of our hair for a while. Consider it a charitable donation." Before I could even formulate a response to his breathtaking audacity, my mother Linda marched into the living room. She carried a silver tray with fresh mimosas, stepping carefully around my muddy, ruined shoes as if my presence was contaminating her spotless hardwood floors. She set the tray down and immediately turned her glare on me, her perfectly manicured hands resting on her hips. "Do not stand there staring at him like an idiot." Savannah Linda snapped, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Pick up the pen and do what your brother-in-law asks. He is doing important, world-changing work. He is bringing actual wealth and prestige into this family." "What exactly do you bring?" "You bring complaints and medical bills." I looked at my mother, searching her face for any hidden trace of maternal instinct. There was none. She was looking at me the same way she looked at the hired help when they failed to polish the silver correctly. "This is a massive financial liability, Mom," I said, bracing my arm against my ribs to ease the stabbing pain. He is asking me to secure a commercial loan that could easily bankrupt me if his company fails. I do not even know the interest rate. Linda let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Bankrupt you? What exactly do you have to lose? Savannah. A 10-year-old sedan and a closet full of discount sweaters. Your sister Brittany actually married a winner. She secured a man who is building a tech empire. She has a beautiful life, a designer wardrobe, and a husband who is about to be a multimillionaire thanks to Vanguard Holdings. All we are asking is for you to be slightly useful to the people who tolerate your miserable attitude. We gave you a roof over your head growing up. You owe us this. Sign the damn paper so Malik can get back to his presentation prep. The utter delusion in the room was suffocating. My mother was completely brainwashed by Malik's rented luxury cars and fabricated tales of corporate dominance. They were actively trying to sacrifice my financial safety net to keep Malik's sinking ship afloat for a few more weeks. They truly believed I was a slow, ignorant woman who would simply bow her head and obey their commands. I looked down at the bridge loan documents. I read the name of the predatory lending firm printed at the top of the page. I saw the exorbitant interest rate buried in the fine print. Then I looked at the signature line where Malik had arrogantly placed his gold pen. I slowly reached out with my uninjured hand. Malik smirked, crossing his arms over his chest in triumph. Linda let out a satisfied sigh, already reaching for her mimosa glass. I picked up the gold pen. It was heavy, ostentatious, and entirely unnecessary, much like the man who owned it. I did not sign the paper. Instead, I calmly tossed the pen over my shoulder. It clattered against the marble fireplace hearth and rolled away into the shadows. No, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Malik's smug smile vanished instantly. His posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing in furious disbelief. Excuse me. What did you just say? I said no, I repeated, looking him dead in the eye. I am not co-signing a predatory loan to cover your fraudulent payroll. If Vanguard Holdings is really giving you $5 million next week, then you can wait a few days. But you and I both know that bridge loans are for desperate people who are out of options. Find another victim, Malik. My flawless credit score belongs to me. Linda slammed her glass down on the tray, spilling orange juice across the silver surface. How dare you speak to him that way? She screamed, her face flushing with sudden rage. You selfish, ungrateful little brat. You are trying to sabotage your own sister's future because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of Brittany. You are a bitter, lonely woman, and you will die alone in that pathetic apartment of yours. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against her toxic venom. The physical pain in my chest was blinding, but the absolute clarity in my mind was absolute perfection. I had seen enough, I had heard enough. I turned my back on them. Malik shouted curses behind me, threatening to have Richard throw me out onto the street. Linda shrieked that I was dead to her, that I was no longer a part of their successful family. I ignored every single word. I gripped the wooden banister and began the agonizing climb up the grand staircase. Every step was a battle against the searing pain in my broken ribs, but I did not stop and I did not look back. Their screaming voices faded into meaningless background noise. I reached the second floor and limped down the long corridor toward my childhood bedroom. I stepped inside and pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The latch clicked into place with a solid, satisfying sound. I turned the deadbolt, locking out the toxicity, the manipulation, and the blatant abuse that had defined my entire existence in this house. I carefully lowered myself onto the edge of the mattress, gritting my teeth against the sharp ache in my torso. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I opened the lid. The screen brightened instantly, casting a cool blue glow across my bruised face. The infrared camera scanned my features, recognizing the specific biometric markers despite the swelling around my cheekbone. A heavy, secure padlock icon appeared on the screen. It spun for a fraction of a second before snapping open. The display transitioned into a highly encrypted proprietary dashboard interface. Bold, minimalist text appeared across the center of the screen, completely devoid of corporate fluff. Welcome, founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I navigated past the global market summaries and clicked directly into my priority investment inbox. There, sitting at the very top of my queue, marked urgent and pending final executive approval, was an extensive digital file. The applicant name read Malik. The requested capital was exactly $5 million. I stared at the file resting in my digital domain. He thought he was a tech visionary dealing with faceless corporate titans. He thought I was a pathetic single bookkeeper with nothing to her name. He had absolutely no idea that the silent, battered woman he had just tried to scam was the exact same billionaire executive holding his entire miserable future in the palm of her hand. I clicked the trackpad, expanding Malik's executive summary. The presentation was a masterclass in corporate illusion. It was filled with vibrant charts, aggressive growth projections, and promises of market disruption. To an amateur investor, or perhaps to my gullible parents, it looked like the next Silicon Valley unicorn. But I did not build Vanguard Holdings by looking at pretty pictures. I bypassed the marketing fluff and dove straight into the raw, unfiltered data room his team had uploaded. It took me less than 4 minutes to dismantle his entire empire. The company was a ghost ship. The user acquisition numbers he touted downstairs were completely fabricated, padded by cheap bot farms and dead accounts. His revolutionary software algorithm, the supposed crown jewel of his operation, was nothing more than a poorly coded prototype that had not seen a successful update in 8 months. The revenue streams were non-existent. Malik was not running a tech company. He was running an incredibly elaborate Ponzi scheme tailored for modern venture capitalists. I opened his cash flow statements. My eyes tracked the columns of numbers narrowing as the true scale of his financial recklessness revealed itself. The burn rate was astronomical. He was bleeding capital faster than a severed artery. But the money was not going towards server space marketing or employee salaries. I cross-referenced the outgoing wire transfers. My fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, pulling up global banking routing protocols I knew by heart. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being systematically siphoned out of the primary operating account. The destination was not a domestic vendor. The funds were being routed through a series of shell corporations before quietly landing in an offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. Malik was embezzling the very seed money he had already secured. He was packing a golden parachute for himself while leaving his current investors to drown. I felt a cold, sharp spike of disgust. He stood in my parents' living room wearing a custom suit and a Rolex, acting like the savior of our family line. In reality, he was a common thief hiding behind a business degree. He was begging for Vanguard to inject $5 million simply to keep the illusion alive for a few more months so he could extract the final drops of cash before abandoning ship. I continued digging. I needed to see exactly how he was currently staying afloat while waiting for my approval. I accessed the liability schedules. He had recently secured a massive influx of capital to temporarily cover his fraudulent tracks. I traced the origin of that specific cash injection. I expected to find a desperate angel investor or a high-risk lending firm. What I found instead made my blood run entirely cold. The capital did not come from an investor. It came from a property equity release. A secondary mortgage had been finalized just 3 weeks ago. I pulled the public property records and stared at the digital deed displayed on my screen. The address listed was the exact house I was currently sitting in. My parents, Richard and Linda, had secretly remortgaged their sprawling suburban estate. They had taken every single dime of equity they had built over 30 years. They had liquidated their entire safety net, risking their retirement and their home, and handed the cash directly to Malik. They did this to fund his fake company. They did this so Brittany could continue parading around in Chanel and driving luxury cars she did not earn. The absolute absurdity of the situation washed over me. Downstairs, my mother had sneered at me. She had called me a pathetic bookkeeper with zero ambition. She had told me I was useless compared to the wealthy, successful man Brittany had married. My father had threatened to throw me out on the street for refusing to co-sign a predatory loan. They treated me like a repulsive burden because they believed I had nothing to offer them. They had bet their entire existence on a smooth-talking fraud who was currently routing their retirement funds to the Caribbean. They had handed their home over to a thief, all while spitting on the daughter who actually possessed the power to make them multimillionaires with a single keystroke. I leaned back in my chair. The physical pain from my broken ribs throbbed beneath my bandages, but it was entirely eclipsed by the magnitude of their sheer stupidity. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their respect. I had accepted their cruelty because I believed deep down that they were simply demanding parents who wanted the best for their children. Now, staring at the financial ruin they had willingly brought upon themselves, I realized they were not just cruel. They were blind, greedy fools, blinded by the allure of fake wealth and empty status. Malik was planning to take the Vanguard money, pay off the high-interest bridge loan to keep himself out of prison, siphon the rest to his Cayman account, and let the bank foreclose on my parents' house. Brittany would undoubtedly file for divorce the moment the money stopped flowing, leaving Richard and Linda homeless and completely bankrupt. I moved my cursor over the bright red reject button on the Vanguard dashboard. One click and Malik's house of cards would instantly collapse. One click and the bank would come for my parents' estate by the end of the month. It would be the easiest, cleanest execution of justice I had ever delivered. I placed my finger on the trackpad. I was ready to press down and end the charade permanently. Suddenly, the harsh, vibrating buzz of my cell phone shattered the heavy silence in my bedroom. The device rattled against the wooden desk, jarring my focus. I pulled my hand away from the laptop and picked up the phone. The screen illuminated the darkened room. It was an incoming call from an unsaved number, but the caller ID text clearly displayed the name of the hospital I had just left. I swiped the screen to accept the call and pressed the speaker to my ear. I did not say a word. A hesitant, rushed voice came through the receiver. It was David, the trauma nurse from the emergency room. He asked if I was in a safe place to talk. I told David I was alone behind a locked door. My voice was steady, but my pulse hammered fiercely against my bruised ribs. He let out a long, ragged exhale. It was the sound of a man carrying a secret too heavy for his conscience. He spoke quickly, his words rushing together in a hushed tone. He explained the internal architecture of the hospital trauma center. Every single outbound call made from the emergency room dispatch desk is automatically routed through a centralized, secure server. It is a strict liability protocol designed to protect the hospital in case a patient passes away and the family attempts to sue for lack of notification. The system records the exact timestamp, the duration of the connection, and the complete audio of the exchange. David confessed he had pulled my file before his shift ended. He said watching me beg for my family while I was coughing up blood had haunted him. He watched me stare at my phone screen, counting 21 missed calls, believing my family was simply unaware of my agony. He could not let me walk out of that hospital believing a lie. He told me he was risking his medical license and his career by accessing the dispatch archives, but some things were more important than hospital policy. He had securely emailed the raw audio file to the address listed on my intake paperwork. A sharp notification chime echoed from my laptop speakers. A new message sat in my inbox, sent from an encrypted, untraceable address. David told me to listen to it from start to finish. He told me he was sorry for what I was about to hear. Then the line went entirely dead. I placed my cell phone face down on the wooden desk. I stared at the email. The subject line was blank. The attachment was a simple audio file icon. For 33 years, I had constructed endless excuses for Richard and Linda. I had rationalized their emotional absence, blaming it on their stressful social obligations or their overwhelming desire to support Brittany. I had always convinced myself that underneath the thick layers of their narcissism, a foundational layer of parental love existed. I believed that in a matter of life or death, the petty favoritism would instantly vanish. I moved my cursor over the attachment. My finger trembled slightly against the trackpad. I took a shallow, painful breath, bracing my fractured ribs, and clicked play. The digital sound wave appeared on my screen, a jagged green line moving across a black background. First, I heard the automated click of the hospital dispatch system initiating the connection. Then came the standard ringing tone. It rang once. It rang twice. On the third ring, the connection clicked open. The timeline stamped on the audio file shattered my first illusion. The timestamp indicated this was the very first call David had placed. It was made exactly 12 minutes after the ambulance had unloaded me onto the trauma bay stretcher. They did not miss 21 calls. They answered the very first one. David's recorded voice filled my quiet bedroom. He sounded incredibly tense, maintaining a tight professional urgency. He asked to speak with Richard immediately. He identified himself as the charge nurse at the emergency trauma center. I listened to David deliver the clinical assessment of my broken body. He informed my father that Savannah had been involved in a high-speed catastrophic collision. He detailed the blunt force trauma to my chest cavity. He explicitly stated that I had sustained 3 broken ribs and a severely compromised airway. He warned my father that my oxygen levels were dropping dangerously low and that the surgical team was preparing for an emergency intubation. David practically begged my father to get in the car and drive to the hospital immediately to sign the emergency surgical consent forms in case my heart stopped on the operating table. Hearing my own near-death experience summarized so clinically triggered a visceral reaction. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My lungs tightened as if I were back on that gurney, choking on my own blood. I remembered staring up at the blinding fluorescent lights of the emergency room ceiling, praying to whatever higher power existed that my father was speeding down the highway to save me. I remembered defending them to David, insisting that they must have left their phones in another room. The agony of that memory clashed violently with the cold, hard reality playing through my laptop speakers. The executive mindset of Vanguard Holdings was meticulously analyzing the data, but the wounded daughter inside me was screaming in silent retrospective terror. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes locked on the moving green sound wave. After David finished his frantic medical report, there was a brief pause on the line. I braced myself, waiting to hear my father gasp in horror. I waited to hear the sound of a chair scraping back, or keys jingling as he sprinted toward the door. Instead, the audio file picked up the ambient background noise from my father's end of the connection. It was not the sound of a quiet suburban living room. It was not the muffled interior of a car rushing through traffic. It was a crystal-clear, high-definition soundscape of sheer luxury. The unmistakable rhythmic melody of a live saxophone floated through the speaker. Underneath the smooth jazz, I could hear the delicate rhythmic clinking of heavy silver cutlery scraping against fine bone china. I heard the low melodic hum of affluent diners laughing and conversing over premium cocktails. It was the exact, undeniable acoustic signature of the outdoor patio at Le Petit Restaurant. I sat motionless as the recording continued to play from my laptop speakers. The sophisticated atmosphere of Le Petit Restaurant leaked through the audio, mocking the sterile silence of my bedroom. The sound of a live saxophone provided a sickeningly sweet melody to the background of my father's betrayal. Through the speaker, I heard David's voice again, his tone rising with professional desperation. He was explaining that I was being prepped for surgery, and that the risk of internal bleeding was high. He was literally begging my father to listen. Then came the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a muffled rustling noise, the distinct sound of a hand being placed over a phone's microphone. My father clearly thought he had blocked the transmission, but the hospital's high-fidelity recording system caught every single word he muttered to my mother. "There goes Savannah again," my father whispered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "She is probably faking the whole thing just to pull us away from Brittany's celebration. She has always been jealous that Brittany married a man of Malik's caliber. Now she wants to play the dying swan, so we have to leave our mimosas and rush to some dingy emergency room." I heard my mother Linda let out a sharp, irritated huff in response. She told my father that it was classic Savannah behavior, always needing to be the center of attention when the spotlight was on someone more successful. She said that if I were actually hurt, I would have had the decency to call a rideshare instead of bothering them during a 5-star brunch. The hand moved away from the microphone, and my father's voice returned to the line now addressed directly to the nurse. His tone had shifted from conspiratorial malice to a cold, dismissive authority. "Listen here," he said to David, ignoring the medical details that had just been shared. "My daughter has a history of being overly dramatic. I am sure she is fine. We are in the middle of a very important family engagement. The waiter is literally standing here with the menus, and we are about to order our entrees. Whatever is happening, she can wait. Call us back in a few hours if she is still there." Then, without waiting for a reply, the audio picked up the sound of him tapping the screen to end the call. I sat in the dark, my eyes fixed on the green sound wave on the screen as it flatlined into a straight line. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. My fractured ribs throbbed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the icy realization that my own parents had prioritized a sea bass entree over my survival. They hadn't just missed the calls. They had answered, listened to a nurse tell them I was dying, and decided that their Sunday brunch was more important. They had branded me a liar while I was gasping for air on a trauma table. The "she can wait" echoed in my head like a death sentence. The executive of Vanguard Holdings within me took over, compartmentalizing the trauma with a precision that was almost frightening. I looked at the timeline again. While they were laughing and ordering expensive cocktails, David had been doing chest compressions. While my mother was complaining about my attention-seeking behavior, a surgeon was inserting a chest tube to keep my lung from collapsing. The absolute terrifying disconnect between the reality of my suffering and their perception of my worth was finally laid bare. They truly viewed me as a prop, a nuisance to be managed, while Brittany and Malik were the only ones allowed to have real lives. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't the stabbing pain of the broken bones. It was the feeling of every emotional connection I had ever felt toward Richard and Linda snapping at once. Every childhood memory of seeking their approval, every holiday spent trying to fit into their narrow definition of success, every dollar I had ever considered giving them when I thought they were struggling. It all turned to ash. I realized that for 33 years I had been an orphan living in a house full of strangers. They didn't know me, and more importantly, they didn't deserve to know me. I reached for the mouse to close the file, my hands steady and cold. I was done. I was going to finish the audit of Malik's company, and I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished, they would all understand the true meaning of waiting. I was going to dismantle their lives with the same casual indifference they had shown mine. They wanted to order their entrees, fine. I was going to make sure that for the rest of their lives they would be lucky if they could afford a meal at a fast food drive-thru. But just as my finger hovered over the exit button, the recording didn't end. There were a few seconds of dead air where the phone hadn't fully disconnected, or perhaps my father had accidentally hit the speaker button before putting the phone down on the table. The background noise of the restaurant rushed back in, but this time a different voice cut through the jazz and the clinking glass. It was sharp, high-pitched, and filled with a terrifyingly calculated greed. It was my sister Brittany. She wasn't asking about my condition. She wasn't worried about the accident. She was speaking with a clarity that made the blood in my veins turn to liquid nitrogen. She had heard the entire conversation with the nurse, and her reaction was the final nail in the coffin of our family. I leaned in, my heart stopping as her voice filled the room. The faint hum of the restaurant ambiance buzzed through the speakers. I leaned closer to the screen. My breath caught in my throat as the sharp, unmistakable pitch of my sister's voice sliced through the background noise of jazz and clinking silverware. Brittany did not sound panicked. She did not sound like a woman who had just been told her younger sister was lying on a trauma table with shattered ribs. Her tone was light, airy, and dripping with a sickening blend of entitlement and casual greed. She spoke as if she were inquiring about the dessert menu. "Dad, wait," Brittany said. Her voice was crystal clear, captured perfectly by the hospital dispatch recording system before the connection fully severed. "If she actually dies in there, does her life insurance and savings account go to me? I really need the cash for that new Tesla." I stopped breathing. My lungs burned against the medical bandages, but the physical agony evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a paralyzing sub-zero chill that radiated from the center of my chest outward to my fingertips. I sat perfectly still. I waited for the inevitable reprimand. I waited for my father to snap at her to tell her to shut her mouth to show even a microscopic fraction of parental decency. I waited for him to remind his golden child that they were discussing a human life. Instead, a low rumbling chuckle vibrated through the audio file. It was Richard. He was laughing. It was a fond, indulgent sound, the exact same chuckle he used when Brittany managed to manipulate a retail worker into giving her a discount on designer shoes. "We will have our lawyers look into her estate, sweetheart," Richard replied, his voice muffled but undeniably affectionate. "Let us just enjoy our mimosas first. Cheers to Malik and his upcoming funding round." The sharp, bright chime of crystal toasting glass against crystal echoed through the recording. Then a sharp click. The line finally went dead. The green audio wave on my screen collapsed into a flat, motionless line. The silence that filled my childhood bedroom was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and profound. I sat on the edge of the mattress, bathed in the harsh blue light of my laptop screen. The tears did not come. My eyes remained completely dry. For 33 years, I had conditioned myself to cry over their cruelty. I had spent countless nights weeping into my pillows, wondering why my straight grades, my quiet obedience, and my financial independence were never enough to earn a single ounce of their respect. I had exhausted my entire capacity for sorrow. Right then, in the freezing stillness of that room, the pathetic, desperate daughter who just wanted to be loved was finally eradicated. The woman who emerged from that emotional slaughter was entirely different. I stared at the flat line on my screen. I analyzed their words with the clinical, ruthless precision of a corporate predator. Brittany was not merely indifferent to my survival. She was actively banking on my demise. She viewed my potential death as a financial windfall, a convenient tragedy that would instantly upgrade her luxury vehicle. My father did not just tolerate her sociopathic greed, he rewarded it. He validated her entitlement while raising a glass to celebrate the very man who was currently attempting to steal their suburban mansion. The sheer breathtaking audacity of their existence washed over me. I recalled every single time I had quietly stepped aside to let Brittany shine. I remembered when Richard and Linda drained my college tuition fund to pay for Brittany's extravagant destination wedding in Italy, forcing me to build my wealth from absolute zero. I remembered Linda demanding I give Brittany my first reliable car because the golden child deserved something safe, leaving me to rely on public transportation while managing my first startup. They had spent 3 decades treating me like an expendable asset, an organ donor whose only purpose was to bleed out so they could thrive. They thought I was a fragile, unremarkable bookkeeper who would quietly expire on a hospital gurney, leaving behind a modest savings account for them to scavenge. They thought they were the apex predators of this suburban jungle, sipping champagne and plotting over my hypothetical grave. They had absolutely no idea they had just provoked a monster. The Vanguard Holdings dashboard glowed brightly on my laptop screen. The pending $5 million investment file for Malik's fraudulent tech shell company sat waiting in the queue. The balance of power had completely shifted. I was no longer the victim trapped in their web of psychological abuse. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I was the silent, unseen billionaire who held the deed to their false reality. A cold, predatory calmness settled into my bones. My heart rate leveled out. The chaotic adrenaline of the car crash and the emergency room faded away entirely. I did not feel angry. Anger was a messy, uncontrolled emotion that led to sloppy mistakes. I felt an absolute terrifying clarity. I was going to strip them of everything. I was going to systematically dismantle their finances, their reputations, and their pathetic social standing. I was going to let them climb to the absolute peak of their arrogant delusions, and then I was going to shatter the ground beneath their feet. I slowly reached across the desk. My fingers, steady and resolute, closed around my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and bypassed my personal contacts. I opened my encrypted corporate directory. I scrolled past the lists of international investors and venture capital partners. I found the direct unlisted number I needed. I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, listening to the secure line ring. I was calling Harrison, the chief legal officer of Vanguard Holdings. Harrison answered on the second ring. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone sharpened by decades of dismantling rival corporations in boardrooms across Manhattan. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply stated his name, expecting a crisis that required his $2,000 an hour expertise. I kept my voice perfectly level, ignoring the sharp stab of agony radiating from my fractured ribs. I told him to pull up the active investment queue on the Vanguard Holdings secure server. I instructed him to locate the $5 million Series A funding request submitted by my brother-in-law Malik. I heard the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line. Harrison hummed a note of severe disapproval as he scanned the executive summary. He immediately noted the glaring red flags. He pointed out the abysmal burn rate, the suspicious offshore wire transfers, and the complete lack of viable proprietary software. He told me the startup was a blatant financial sinkhole. He strongly advised me to issue an immediate rejection and flag the applicant for potential investor fraud. I told Harrison I completely agreed with his assessment. The company was a total sham. Then I gave him an order that made the veteran lawyer fall entirely silent. I instructed him to approve the $5 million capital injection immediately. Harrison paused. He asked me to repeat the directive, assuming the encrypted connection had distorted my words. I did not stutter. I told him I wanted the full $5 million authorized and the digital contracts drafted within the next 30 minutes. However, I required a very specific, highly lethal addition to the standard investment agreement. I wanted him to embed a financial death warrant deep within the 70 pages of legal jargon. I demanded a poison pill clause. I explained exactly how I wanted the trap constructed. The contract had to explicitly state that the $5 million investment was contingent upon the absolute financial transparency of the founder. The moment Vanguard Holdings detected a single cent of misappropriated funds, offshore embezzlement, or fraudulent payroll reporting, the corporate veil would be instantly pierced. The protection of his limited liability company would evaporate. Harrison caught on immediately. His tone shifted from professional concern to predatory fascination. He asked how deep I wanted the hooks to go. I told him I wanted the hooks to scrape the bone. The poison pill had to grant Vanguard Holdings the immediate, unchallengeable right to seize all corporate and personal assets attached to the primary guarantor. It had to explicitly bypass standard bankruptcy protections. Furthermore, the clause needed to include an automatic trigger for federal criminal prosecution. By signing the document, Malik would be legally consenting to a full forensic audit by our internal team. Since I already knew he was siphoning money to the Cayman Islands the second his digital signature hit the contract, he would be retroactively confessing to felony wire fraud. Harrison warned me about the collateral damage. He reminded me that Malik had leveraged a secondary mortgage on a residential property to secure his short-term bridge loans. He warned that triggering this specific clause would give Vanguard the immediate right to foreclose on that specific property. He told me the owners of that suburban estate would be thrown out onto the street with absolutely zero legal recourse. I looked around my dark childhood bedroom. I thought about my father laughing at my potential death. I thought about my mother complaining that my injuries were ruining their mimosa brunch. I thought about Brittany calculating the payout of my life insurance policy to buy a luxury car. I told Harrison I was fully aware of the collateral damage. I told him the owners of that estate were a necessary casualty of doing business. I commanded him to draft the paperwork and send it directly to my executive inbox for final review. Harrison did not ask any more questions. He recognized the tone of a chief executive officer who had just declared absolute war. He promised the documents would be ready in 20 minutes. He hung up the phone. I sat perfectly still in the dim blue light of my laptop screen. The physical pain in my chest was completely neutralized by the icy, calculated adrenaline pumping through my veins. I was no longer the disappointing single daughter. I was the executioner. Exactly 18 minutes later, a secure notification popped up on my Vanguard dashboard. The legal department had uploaded the finalized contract. I opened the file. Harrison was an absolute artist. The poison pill clause was buried flawlessly in Section 42, Paragraph C. It was masked behind layers of dense, impenetrable financial terminology that a desperate, arrogant man like Malik would never bother to read. It looked like a standard compliance waiver. In reality, it was a loaded gun pointed directly at his head. I reviewed the final signature blocks. Everything was perfectly arranged. I moved my cursor to the top right corner of the screen. I hovered over the bright green button labeled Authorize and Dispatch. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. I clicked the button. The screen flashed briefly confirming the automated email had been successfully deployed from the Vanguard Holdings secure server directly to Malik's corporate inbox. I closed my laptop and set it gently on the desk. The silence in my bedroom returned thick and heavy with anticipation. I stared at the closed wooden door, listening intently to the muffled sounds of the house below. For exactly 45 seconds, there was nothing. Just the low hum of the central air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Then it happened. A sudden explosive roar of pure, unfiltered triumph erupted from the living room, directly beneath my feet. It was Malik. He screamed at the top of his lungs, a loud, booming cheer that rattled the floorboards. I could hear Brittany shriek in sheer delight, her voice pitching high and frantic. I heard the unmistakable sound of my mother clapping her hands wildly, shouting that they were finally rich. My father yelled over the commotion, praising his brilliant, successful son-in-law. They were celebrating. They were jumping up and down, popping imaginary champagne corks, and cheering for the millions of dollars they believed had just secured their extravagant lifestyle forever. They had received the email. Malik had seen the Vanguard Holdings logo and the $5 million approval. In his blind, arrogant desperation, he had scrolled straight to the bottom and digitally signed the document without reading a single page of the lethal trap I had just hand-delivered to him. I sat in the cold darkness of my room, listening to the echoing sounds of their joyous celebration. A slow, chilling smile spread across my bruised face. The contract was signed. The poison was in their veins. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. The smell of seared filet mignon and roasted garlic drifted up the grand staircase, invading the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom. The chaotic screaming and cheering from earlier had eventually settled into the loud, boastful chatter of a hastily arranged victory dinner. I sat on the edge of my bed, carefully adjusting the tight medical compression wrap around my fractured ribs. Every single inhalation was a sharp, stabbing reminder of the emergency room they had abandoned me in. I could have stayed hidden in the dark. I could have locked the door and let them feast on their delusions of grandeur. But predators do not hide from their prey. I needed to look them in the eye. I needed to witness the absolute peak of their arrogance before the ground opened up and swallowed them whole. I slowly pulled an oversized dark cashmere sweater over my head to conceal the thick layers of white bandages. I gripped the wooden banister and navigated the stairs one agonizing step at a time. The dining room was bathed in the warm golden glow of the massive crystal chandelier. My father had brought out his most expensive vintage champagne to mark the occasion. Malik was seated at the absolute head of the long mahogany table. That was a position Richard fiercely guarded and normally reserved exclusively for himself. Seeing Malik occupying that chair was a blatant visual confirmation of the new family hierarchy. Malik was their savior. Malik was their golden ticket to the elite social circles they so desperately craved to enter. I stepped into the dining room silently. The loud laughter abruptly died down. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward me, brimming with varying degrees of hostility and sheer annoyance. I ignored their glares and pulled out a chair at the furthest, darkest end of the table. I sat down heavily, keeping my spine rigid to protect my injured chest. My mother Linda slammed her crystal glass down on the table. The champagne sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth. She crossed her arms and glared at me with absolute revulsion. She announced to the entire room that it was incredibly generous of them to allow a miserable, injured freeloader to share a meal of this caliber. She told me I was a walking rain cloud, a pathetic dark mark on what was otherwise the most glorious day in the history of our family. She said I should be down on my knees thanking Malik for his monumental success, because his impending wealth was the only reason I was not being kicked out onto the street with my broken bones. I kept my face completely blank. I did not offer a defense. I simply reached for my water glass and took a slow, measured sip. My silence only fueled their arrogant fire. Malik leaned back in his chair, swirling the expensive champagne in his glass. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist caught the chandelier light, a fake symbol of wealth masking a mountain of debt. His face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of unearned victory. He boasted loudly that Vanguard Holdings was practically begging to give him the $5 million. He claimed that the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of the venture capital firm must be completely desperate for true visionary talent to blindly fund his operation. He laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the dining room walls. He proudly declared that the automated approval process was a complete joke. He stated he had bypassed their entire legal department, completely ignoring the terms of service because his pitch deck was just that incredibly flawless. Brittany giggled beside him, leaning over to kiss his cheek. She flipped her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder and announced that she would be calling a luxury real estate agent tomorrow morning. She declared that they would be house hunting in Bel Air by next month and looking into buying a private yacht before the summer ended. Richard raised his glass high in the air, offering a booming toast to a son-in-law who actually knew how to conquer the corporate world and bring tangible value to the family name. Linda pointed her heavy silver fork directly at my face. She demanded I pay very close attention to the man sitting at the head of the table. She said this was what real ambition looked like. She ridiculed my quiet life, my small apartment, and my invisible career. She called me a pathetic drain on their resources, insisting that my catastrophic car accident was nothing more than a highly manipulative distraction from a truly historic day. She told me I was a parasite who only knew how to consume the energy of successful people. She did not stop there. Linda demanded that I verbalize my gratitude immediately. She ordered me to look at Malik and thank him for elevating our family status. She reminded me that my upcoming hospital bills were a massive financial burden, a burden they would now generously tolerate only because Malik was about to be filthy rich. She wanted me to bow my head and acknowledge my absolute inferiority in the presence of a future tech billionaire. She demanded I show respect to the man who was keeping a roof over my head. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the searing physical pain radiating through my chest cavity. I did not let them see the cold, calculating fury burning directly behind my eyes. I picked up my heavy steak knife in my right hand and my silver fork in my left. I pressed the tines into the thick cut of meat on my plate. I sliced a perfectly square piece of filet mignon with deliberate, methodical precision. The sharp metal blade scraped softly against the expensive porcelain plate. The high-pitched scratching sound cut through the heavy tension in the room. It drew their attention instantly. The loud boasting ceased. The table grew entirely quiet as they watched me. I brought the piece of meat to my mouth. I chewed my food, deliberately swallowed, and reached for a linen napkin. I dabbed the corners of my mouth with slow, elegant grace. I lowered my hands and rested them on the table. I looked directly into Malik's arrogant, bloodshot eyes. I tilted my head slightly to the side, projecting an aura of mild, completely innocent curiosity. I asked him if he had a lawyer, carefully read the indemnification clauses before he blindly signed the digital contract. Malik stared at me for a fraction of a second before a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter erupted from his chest. He threw his head back, his broad shoulders shaking against the tailored fabric of his expensive suit. The sound was harsh and grating, completely shattering the brief moment of silence I had created. He looked around the mahogany dining table, making eye contact with Richard and Linda, inviting them to join in his amusement. My father chuckled along, shaking his head, as if I had just told a deeply embarrassing joke. My mother rolled her eyes and took another long sip of her vintage champagne. He wiped a fake tear from the corner of his eye and leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the pristine white tablecloth. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. He asked me if I honestly believed that a top-tier venture capital firm like Vanguard Holdings would try to pull a fast one on a seasoned tech executive. He practically spat the words at me, his voice dripping with condescension. He told me I was completely financially illiterate. He said it was incredibly cute that a lowly bookkeeper who spent her days organizing petty cash receipts for small businesses thought she could offer legal advice to a man who navigated the corporate stratosphere. He reminded me that he held an advanced business degree and interacted with elite attorneys on a daily basis. He claimed that the indemnification clauses I was so worried about were nothing more than standard boilerplate jargon meant to protect the institution from amateur-hour startups. He proudly announced that he did not need a lawyer to hold his hand and read a digital document because his intellect was vastly superior to the bureaucratic drones who drafted it. Malik picked up his heavy crystal glass and pointed it at my face. He stated that successful people do not waste their valuable time agonizing over the fine print. He said true visionaries recognize a golden opportunity and seize it instantly without hesitation. He boasted that Vanguard recognized his unparalleled genius immediately, which is exactly why the $5 million approval bypassed the usual months of tedious legal review. He genuinely believed his fraudulent pitch deck was so magnetic, so incredibly revolutionary, that a multi-billion-dollar investment fund had essentially handed him a blank check. He sneered, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. He told me my question was the exact reason I was a miserable single woman living a totally insignificant life. He said I was paralyzed by fear and completely lacked the aggressive instinct required to build an empire. He assured the entire table that the contract was ironclad in his favor and that he had secured his fortune entirely on his own merit. Brittany could not resist the opportunity to pile on. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand down on the table, the diamonds on her fingers flashing under the chandelier light. She glared at me, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure resentment and vanity. She accused me of trying to sabotage the happiest moment of her entire life, just because I was deeply pathetically jealous. She told me it was sickening to watch me sit there in my oversized sweater, broken and bitter, trying to rain on their parade. She reminded the room that she was the one who had successfully married a brilliant entrepreneur, while I could not even manage to keep a man interested for more than a few months. Brittany announced that my warning about the contract was just a desperate, transparent attempt to make myself feel important. She said I was suffocating under the weight of my own mediocrity. She proudly declared that starting next week she would be shopping for a brand new luxury vehicle and hiring a private interior designer for their future mansion. She told me I would be lucky if she even allowed me to step foot in her new driveway. She said my jealousy was a toxic disease and that I was terrified of being left behind while the rest of the family ascended to the ranks of the ultra-wealthy. Linda clapped her hands together, a sharp sound that echoed off the dining room walls. She praised Brittany for her fierce loyalty and agreed completely. My mother looked at me with cold, dead eyes and told me I was an absolute disgrace. She said I had no right to question Malik's business acumen. She demanded that I apologize to him immediately for daring to imply he was anything less than a financial mastermind. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table. The physical pain radiating from my fractured ribs was completely eclipsed by the profound, intoxicating satisfaction of watching them dig their own graves. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of apology. I simply looked at Malik, absorbing his arrogant, ignorant boasting. He was so blindingly proud of his ability to execute a digital signature. He was so thoroughly convinced of his own supremacy that he had willfully locked the handcuffs around his own wrists. He had legally authorized a forensic audit of his offshore accounts. He had personally granted Vanguard the legal right to seize the very roof over his head. I watched him take another triumphant gulp of my father's vintage champagne. I watched Brittany adjust her expensive designer dress, dreaming of a billionaire lifestyle she was never going to experience. I watched my parents beam with pride at the man who was currently bankrupting them. I did not need to say anything else. The trap was not just set. The trap had already snapped shut, and they were happily celebrating inside the steel jaws. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch out as they glared at me, waiting for me to break. I reached for my glass of ice water. I brought the rim to my lips, maintaining unbreakable eye contact with Malik. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I placed the glass back onto the white tablecloth with a soft, final thud. Then the heavy oak front door of the suburban mansion reverberated with a violent, aggressive sound. The doorbell began ringing wildly, an incessant, piercing chime that completely shattered the smug atmosphere in the dining room. Someone was pounding their fists relentlessly against the solid wood, demanding immediate entry. The relentless pounding against the heavy oak front door echoed through the grand foyer, completely shattering the pretentious atmosphere of the dining room. The crystal chandelier seemed to vibrate with every aggressive strike. My father Richard slammed his linen napkin onto the table, his face flushing with aristocratic outrage. He muttered about the sheer audacity of uninvited guests disrupting a private celebration. My mother Linda clutched her champagne flute, her eyes darting toward the foyer in utter disbelief. Malik attempted to maintain his mask of absolute superiority. He chuckled a thin, nervous sound and adjusted his silk tie. He proudly announced to the table that it was probably just another eager courier delivering congratulations from his vast network of Silicon Valley admirers. He stood up slowly, projecting the calm, unbothered aura of a billionaire, and walked toward the entrance. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. He did not find a courier holding a gift basket. A stunning, fiercely dressed African-American woman shoved her way past him and marched directly into the center of the foyer. She was breathtakingly stylish. She wore a sharply tailored crimson blazer, stiletto heels that clicked aggressively against the imported marble floor, and carried a limited-edition leather handbag. Her presence radiated absolute, unapologetic fury. This was Jasmine. Malik froze entirely. The smug, triumphant grin melted off his face, replaced instantly by the pale, chalky complexion of a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. He reached out his hands, trembling slightly, desperately, trying to block her path to the dining room. Jasmine slapped his hand away with incredible force. She did not lower her voice. She did not care about the vintage champagne or the filet mignon sitting on the table. She stared him dead in the eyes and demanded to know why her premium credit card had just been declined at a luxury boutique downtown. She yelled that she was entirely sick of his pathetic excuses. She explicitly demanded her monthly allowance, screaming that he had promised the wire transfer would clear by Friday morning. She told him she was not going to wait another minute while he played house in the suburbs. The dining room descended into a state of absolute paralyzed shock. Brittany stood up so fast her chair screeched violently against the hardwood floor. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched toward the foyer, her voice pitching into a shrill, hysterical screech. She demanded to know who this woman was and why she was screaming about allowances in her parents' house. Linda gasped loudly, pressing her hand over her heart, as if she were about to faint from the sheer scandal of the situation. Richard stepped forward, demanding that Malik explain this outrageous intrusion immediately. I remained perfectly still in my chair at the far end of the long mahogany table. I did not gasp. I did not stand up. I simply watched the beautiful chaos unfold. The physical pain in my fractured ribs was completely non-existent. I was observing a masterclass in self-destruction. Malik was backed into a corner, surrounded by his furious wife, his bewildered in-laws, and his highly volatile mistress. The sheer panic in his eyes was intoxicating to witness. But Malik was a professional con artist. He had survived this long by spinning elaborate webs of corporate deceit. He took a deep, shuddering breath and forced a wide, completely unnatural smile onto his face. He turned to Brittany, holding his hands up in a gesture of absolute innocence. He let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded entirely hollow. He told Brittany to calm down immediately. He smoothly shifted into his CEO persona, utilizing his rapid-fire corporate jargon to confuse and manipulate his audience. He gestured toward Jasmine and introduced her to my parents as an eccentric, highly aggressive angel investor from his initial seed funding round. He lied with breathtaking ease. He claimed Jasmine had provided the crucial early capital for his tech startup and was simply experiencing a bout of extreme anxiety regarding her equity payout. He told Brittany that high net worth investors were notoriously demanding, and that her shouting about an allowance was just her colorful way of demanding her monthly dividend distributions. He assured Richard and Linda that this was perfectly normal behavior in the cutthroat world of venture capital. He insisted that Jasmine was just passionately protecting her financial interests and had overreacted because the massive Vanguard Holdings capital injection had not hit the operating account yet. Brittany hesitated. Her profound ignorance regarding corporate finance made her the perfect victim for his gaslighting. She looked at Jasmine's expensive designer clothes and the luxury handbag. The sheer quality of Jasmine's attire momentarily validated Malik's lie. Brittany slowly lowered her voice, visibly confused by the dense financial terminology Malik was throwing at her. Richard nodded slowly, desperately, wanting to believe that his son-in-law was a tech genius dealing with aggressive stakeholders rather than an adulterer hiding a secret life. Linda immediately smoothed her hair and offered Jasmine a terribly strained, awkward smile, totally fooled by the angel investor narrative. Jasmine opened her mouth, ready to unleash a torrent of truth that would shatter his ridiculous alibi into a million pieces. Malik saw the incoming detonation. He lunged forward, grabbing Jasmine firmly by the elbow before she could utter a single syllable. He flashed another plastic smile at my parents. He loudly declared that he needed to take his highly valued investor outside to discuss the complex logistics of her return on investment in private. He insisted that discussing strict liquidity parameters in the foyer was a breach of corporate confidentiality. He did not give her a chance to resist. He practically dragged Jasmine through the living room, his fingers digging into the fabric of her crimson blazer. He shoved open the heavy glass patio doors and pulled her out into the dark, manicured backyard, slamming the glass shut behind them to cut off the sound of her screaming voice. The heavy silence returned to the dining room. Brittany exhaled a long, shaky breath and sat back down, completely manipulated into submission. Richard muttered something about the chaotic nature of the modern tech industry. Linda rushed to refill the champagne glasses, eager to wash away the unpleasant interruption, and return to their delusional celebration. I sat at the end of the table, entirely ignored by the three of them. My eyes were fixed on the polished marble floor of the foyer. During the aggressive physical struggle near the entryway, Jasmine had roughly jerked her arm away from Malik's grip. The sudden violent motion had caused her limited edition leather handbag to tip sideways. A small, neatly folded piece of thick, high-quality paper had slipped from the open compartment and fluttered silently to the ground. It rested perfectly still against the dark veins of the marble tile. No one had noticed it fall. No one was looking in that direction. I slowly stood up from my chair, keeping my posture rigid. I quietly excused myself from the table, stating that the commotion had aggravated my injuries. They did not even look at me. They simply waved me away, eager to rid themselves of my presence. I walked slowly and deliberately across the dining room, heading straight toward the grand staircase. As I passed through the foyer, I calculated the exact distance. I did not break my stride. I smoothly slid my shoe over the thick piece of paper, trapping it firmly beneath my sole. I seamlessly bent down, pretending to adjust the strap of my flat shoe, and slipped the paper directly into the deep pocket of my oversized cashmere sweater. I continued my agonizing climb up the stairs to my childhood bedroom. Once I was safely behind my locked door, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the prize. I smoothed out the heavy paper under the blue light of my laptop screen. It was a pristine, freshly printed shopping receipt from the flagship Cartier boutique downtown. The total amount was staggering. But the item purchased was not what mattered. What mattered was the exact billing information printed clearly at the bottom of the page. The luxury jewelry had been purchased using a premium credit card. The name printed on that specific credit card account did not belong to Malik. It did not belong to Jasmine. The name printed on the Cartier receipt was Richard. I smoothed out the crumpled piece of thick textured paper under the harsh blue light of my laptop screen. The ink was fresh, the branding unmistakable. It was a pristine receipt from the flagship Cartier boutique located in the most exclusive shopping district downtown. The item listed on the heavy cardstock was a diamond-encrusted love bracelet. The final price tag was exactly $40,000. But the most damning, absolutely sickening piece of evidence was not the extravagant cost or the luxury brand itself. It was the payment method printed clearly at the absolute bottom of the page. The transaction had been authorized and processed using a premium credit card. The name printed on that specific credit account did not belong to Malik. It did not belong to Jasmine. It belonged to my father, Richard. I sat back in my chair, letting the sheer breathtaking magnitude of their collective stupidity wash over me. Richard and Linda had not just secretly mortgaged their sprawling suburban estate to fund Malik's fake tech empire. They had literally handed him a blank check, an open, unsecured line of credit drawn directly from the equity of their family home. And Malik had taken that money, the absolute last financial lifeline my aging parents possessed, and used it to purchase high-end luxury jewelry for his secret mistress. My mother was currently downstairs pouring vintage champagne, utterly convinced she was rubbing elbows with a future billionaire. My father was puffing his chest, beaming with pride at a son-in-law who was systematically robbing him blind. Brittany was dreaming of a mansion in Bel Air, blissfully unaware that her husband was actively funding his infidelity using her parents' retirement savings. The betrayal was so poetic, so perfectly symmetrical that it transcended my anger and became high art. They had built a throne of lies, and they had paid for the privilege of sitting on it. I stood up from my desk and moved silently toward the large bay window of my bedroom. I pulled the heavy curtain back just a fraction of an inch, peering down into the manicured backyard. The outdoor patio lights illuminated the scene perfectly. Malik was aggressively shoving Jasmine toward the side gate. His hands were moving frantically as he hissed desperate instructions at her. I could easily guess his lies. He was likely promising her a massive, untraceable wire transfer the exact second the Vanguard Holdings capital hit his operating account. Jasmine looked entirely unimpressed, slapping his hand away one final time before turning on her stiletto heels and disappearing into the night. Malik stood alone in the dark for a long moment. He ran a trembling hand over his sweating face, forcibly reconstructing the shattered facade of his fraudulent persona. He adjusted his silk tie, squared his broad shoulders, and marched back through the glass patio doors into the dining room. I could hear the forced, booming confidence returning to his voice as the sound carried up the grand staircase. He loudly announced to Richard and Linda that the aggressive investor had been successfully neutralized. He spun a ridiculous, fabricated tale about how he had masterfully renegotiated her equity position, securing an even larger profit margin for the family. Brittany let out a high-pitched squeal of relief. She praised her husband for being so incredibly dominant in the cutthroat world of venture capital. Richard loudly commended Malik for handling the stressful business negotiation with absolute grace. But Malik needed more than just verbal validation. He needed to completely eradicate any lingering shadow of doubt caused by Jasmine's explosive intrusion. He needed a grand, undeniable gesture to solidify his status as the undisputed king of the household. I heard his heavy footsteps echo as he moved into the adjoining home office. He returned to the dining room moments later. I knew exactly what he was holding. He loudly slammed his silver laptop onto the mahogany dining table, shoving aside the plates of half-eaten filet mignon. He declared to the room that he was tired of waiting. He announced that it was time to officially close the Vanguard Holdings deal and secure their multi-million-dollar future right then and there. I hurried back to my desk and dropped into my chair. I refreshed the secure Vanguard administration dashboard. The real-time analytics showed a new user logging into the document portal. It was Malik. Downstairs, his voice escalated into a theatrical performance. He boasted to my parents that the Vanguard legal department had sent over a 70-page contract filled with useless bureaucratic red tape. He scoffed loudly, telling Richard that reading the fine print was a pathetic waste of time reserved for miserable low-level employees. He claimed that true visionaries operated on instinct and momentum, assuring everyone that his intellect was far superior to any corporate lawyer. I watched the digital tracker on my screen with cold, predatory anticipation. The progress bar for the contract review bypassed page 5, then page 20, then page 50 in a matter of seconds. He was aggressively scrolling straight to the absolute bottom of the document. He was completely ignoring the highly lethal poison pill clause embedded securely in Section 42. He was ignoring the explicit terms that authorized a total forensic audit and the immediate seizure of all personal assets, including the house he was currently standing in. He was so desperate to prove his worth, so eager to drown out the echoes of his mistress screaming in the foyer, that he threw caution to the wind entirely. The sound of a heavy, aggressive keystroke echoed from the dining room below. It was followed instantly by a triumphant, deafening roar from Malik. He shouted that the deal was officially done. Brittany screamed in pure ecstasy. Linda began weeping tears of sheer joy, thanking whatever higher power she believed in for delivering such a magnificent son-in-law. Richard proposed another loud, arrogant toast to their impending massive wealth. Up in the cold, quiet sanctuary of my childhood bedroom, the harsh glare of my laptop screen shifted. A bright red notification banner flashed across the top of the Vanguard secure portal. Simultaneously, my encrypted cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden desk. I picked up the device. The automated confirmation text message from the Vanguard executive system illuminated the dark room. I stared at the bold, undeniable text glowing brightly on the screen. The contract has been signed. The trap is sprung. The Waldorf Astoria stood as a towering monument to old money and untouchable prestige. Tonight, however, its grand ballroom had been rented out by desperate people, playing a very expensive game of pretend. Malik and my father had pulled out all the stops to celebrate the impending $5 million capital injection from Vanguard Holdings. They had hired a small army of valet attendants, rolled out an actual red carpet across the pristine sidewalk, and commissioned a string quartet to play near the gilded entrance doors. I knew for an absolute fact that they had financed this entire lavish gala on credit. They were drowning in predatory debt, yet they were busy pouring high-end champagne for city council members and local socialites just to stroke their own massive egos. A sleek obsidian black Maybach glided silently up to the curb, bypassing the line of standard luxury sedans. The valet rushed forward, his white-gloved hand reaching for the polished silver handle. He pulled the heavy door open. I did not stumble. I did not limp. The broken ribs wrapping my chest were securely bound beneath a custom corset hidden entirely from the world. I stepped out of the vehicle and onto the red carpet. The pathetic, invisible bookkeeper they had left to die in the emergency room was gone. I was wearing a floor-length midnight blue Tom Ford evening gown. The structure of the dress was severely architectural, featuring razor-sharp shoulders and a plunging neckline that radiated absolute unapologetic power. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style, and my makeup was flawless, masking the fading bruises along my cheekbone. I wore no jewelry save for a single pair of diamond stud earrings. True wealth does not need to scream for attention. It simply arrives and demands compliance. I walked up the carpet with the measured, predatory grace of a woman who owned the very ground beneath her feet. Flashbulbs from the local photographers Malik had undoubtedly hired for his vanity project illuminated the entrance. I ignored them, keeping my eyes fixed directly on the towering brass doors of the main ballroom. Through the glass panes, I could see the extravagant party in full swing. Richard was standing near a towering ice sculpture, aggressively shaking hands with men in rented tuxedos. Malik was holding court near the open bar, laughing loudly and pointing at a projection screen that displayed his fraudulent corporate logo. But it was my mother Linda and my sister Brittany who spotted me first. They were standing near the guest check-in table, acting as the self-appointed gatekeepers of their fabricated high society event. Brittany was wearing a heavily sequined designer dress that looked incredibly desperate. Linda was draped in the exact Cartier jewelry my father had purchased using the stolen equity from their home. I watched the blood rapidly drain from both of their faces. Their eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock as they took in the Maybach, the Tom Ford gown, and the undeniable aura of authority I carried. For a fraction of a second, they were completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of my transformation. Then the shock morphed instantly into vicious territorial panic. Linda and Brittany abandoned their post at the guest book and practically sprinted across the marble lobby to intercept me. They threw themselves directly into my path, physically blocking my access to the grand ballroom doors. "What in the world do you think you are doing here?" Linda hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting the attention of the wealthy guests milling nearby. Her eyes darted wildly over my expensive gown, her face twisting into an ugly mask of confusion and rage. "Are you completely out of your mind? You are not on the guest list." Brittany stepped forward, crossing her arms aggressively over her sequined chest. She looked me up and down, a nasty, condescending sneer forming on her lips. "Did you seriously empty your pathetic little savings account to rent a car and a designer dress just to crash my husband's victory party? You look absolutely ridiculous, Savannah. You are making a complete fool of yourself. Get out of here right now before you ruin everything." I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two women who had mocked my near-death experience over a plate of seafood. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of intimidation. "I am going inside," I said, my tone flat and uncompromising. "Step aside." Linda actually gasped, utterly scandalized by my defiance. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging sharply into the fabric of my sleeve. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of cheap mints and expensive alcohol. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat." Linda spat, her voice trembling with frantic anger. "Malik is the future of this family. Tonight is the most important night of his entire career. The anonymous executives from Vanguard Holdings are sending their top representatives here tonight to officially finalize the $5 million contract. We have city officials in that room. We have elite investors. I will not allow you to waltz in here and embarrass us in front of the people who actually matter. You are a complete embarrassment to the family name." Brittany nodded vigorously, pulling her cell phone out of her luxury handbag. She glared at me with absolute malice. "I am calling the hotel security right now," she threatened, waving the device in my face. "I am going to have them drag you out of this lobby and throw you onto the street where you belong. You are not going to destroy Malik's reputation with your desperate attention-seeking behavior." I looked at the hand my mother had clamped around my arm, the same hand that had refused to pick up the phone when I was bleeding out on a hospital gurney. I slowly raised my free hand. I brought it down hard, swatting Linda's hand away with a sharp, forceful strike. The sudden impact made her stumble backward in sheer shock. She clutched her wrist, her jaw dropping open as she stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. I smoothed the sleeve of my Tom Ford gown. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes, then shifted my gaze to my sister's furious face. "Call security," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear glacial authority. "Call them right now, Brittany. Have me thrown out. Have me dragged onto the sidewalk. But you should know one thing before you make that call." I stepped closer, forcing them to look up at me. I delivered the words with the precise, lethal execution of a guillotine blade dropping. If I am not inside that ballroom in the next 5 minutes, Vanguard Holdings will not release a single cent of that $5 million. Linda and Brittany froze. Their mouths hung open in identical expressions of complete, staggering disbelief. They stared at me, blinking rapidly, their brains entirely incapable of processing the magnitude of the statement I had just made. They looked at my calm, unboding expression, and the absolute certainty in their eyes shifted. They genuinely believed the car crash had finally caused me to lose my mind entirely. I left my mother and sister standing completely paralyzed by the entrance of the Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom. Their frantic warnings and desperate threats meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I reached out and pushed the heavy brass doors open. The thick padded fabric yielded smoothly to my touch. The air inside the extravagant hall was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements, roasted prime rib, and the unmistakable intoxicating aroma of unearned wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden, victorious glow over the hundreds of guests. I navigated through the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. My midnight blue Tom Ford dress parted the massive crowd of local politicians, naive investors, and wealthy socialites like a sharp blade slicing through silk. I did not rush. I walked down the long center aisle with the deliberate, measured, and entirely unbothered pace of an executioner ascending the steps of a scaffold. I kept my posture rigidly straight, ensuring the medical corset binding my 3 fractured ribs remained entirely hidden beneath the architectural structure of my gown. At the far end of the lavishly decorated hall stood a heavily illuminated elevated stage. It was framed by massive, ridiculous displays of imported white orchids that my parents had undoubtedly financed on a high-interest predatory credit card. Malik stood dead center at the mahogany podium. He looked incredibly smug, adjusting his custom silk tie and gripping the microphone with a sickening level of arrogant familiarity. The heavy gold Rolex glinted aggressively under the bright stage lights. He was mid-sentence, his booming, overly confident voice echoing perfectly across the captivated audience through the state-of-the-art sound system. He spoke passionately about corporate innovation. He spoke about digital disruption. He painted a masterful, entirely fabricated portrait of himself as a modern-day tech messiah who was single-handedly steering the future of global commerce. He spouted empty corporate buzzwords, throwing around terms like synergy, paradigm shift, and scalable ecosystem with the practiced ease of a career con artist. The crowd hung onto his every single lie, completely mesmerized by the aggressive, charismatic illusion he had constructed. In the absolute front row, sitting at a velvet-draped VIP table directly beneath the stage, my father Richard beamed with grotesque, unfiltered pride. He held a crystal flute of vintage champagne in his right hand. He was nodding vigorously at every empty promise his son-in-law delivered. Richard looked like a man who believed he had finally secured his rightful permanent place among the city elite. He adjusted his rented tuxedo jacket, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting directly on top of a massive financial landmine that I had personally armed. Malik shifted his posture at the podium, expertly projecting a tone of deep manufactured humility. He smiled broadly, his white teeth flashing under the spotlights, and raised his hand toward the ceiling. He announced to the breathless room that absolutely none of this monumental success, none of this groundbreaking technological advancement would be possible without the incredible foresight of Vanguard Holdings. He practically purred into the microphone. He expressed his deepest, most profound gratitude to the brilliant, anonymous chief executive officer of the venture capital fund. Malik boldly claimed that this mysterious billionaire visionary was the only person in the entire financial industry smart enough and brave enough to truly understand the sheer undeniable magnitude of his genius. He told the applauding audience that Vanguard had not just invested $5 million into his company, but they had invested in a legacy that would change the world forever. Right on cue, Harrison emerged from the dark shadows off stage. My chief legal officer moved with the cold, predatory grace of a great white shark swimming effortlessly through a school of bleeding fish. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal gray suit. His face was a mask of absolute terrifying neutrality. He did not smile at the clapping crowd. He walked directly up the wooden steps and approached the podium with heavy, deliberate strides. Malik looked momentarily confused. His fake, charismatic smile faltered for just a fraction of an inch. He clearly expected a low-level public relations representative to walk out holding a giant, oversized novelty check for the cameras. He did not expect a ruthless corporate attorney who charged $2,000 an hour to hijack his presentation. Malik awkwardly stepped aside, gesturing for Harrison to take the microphone, foolishly assuming this was the formal public validation of his fraudulent empire. Harrison adjusted the microphone stand with slow, deliberate precision. He looked out over the sea of wealthy guests, his eyes cold and aggressively assessing. He did not thank Malik. He did not offer a single word of praise for the startup company. He did not acknowledge Richard sitting proudly in the front row. Harrison simply stated that Vanguard Holdings operated on a strict foundation of absolute truth, rigorous financial auditing, and zero tolerance for deception. His deep, gravelly voice echoed through the massive ballroom. He declared that the firm did not just hand out capital to anyone with a smooth pitch deck and a rented suit. He explicitly stated that every single decision, every legal contract, and every execution of justice came directly from the very top of the food chain. Harrison took a deliberate step back from the mahogany podium. He extended his right arm, gesturing toward the center of the grand ballroom. His voice boomed through the high-definition speakers, slicing violently through the heavy, expectant silence of the room. He announced that it was his distinct professional honor to yield the floor to the sole architect of Vanguard Holdings. He officially introduced the chief executive officer and founder. High above the ballroom floor, the technical director followed the strict, uncompromising instructions I had provided just hours earlier. A massive, blinding white spotlight snapped on with a sharp electronic click. The intense beam of light sliced through the dim, golden ambiance of the room like a physical weapon. It swept rapidly over the heads of the confused guests, darting past the VIP tables, illuminating the ice sculptures, and flying over the sea of stunned faces. It moved with terrifying mechanical purpose until it stopped abruptly. The bright burning circle of light anchored itself directly, flawlessly, and undeniably onto me. I stood perfectly still in the exact center of the main aisle, illuminated brightly in the darkness. The midnight blue fabric of my gown absorbed the harsh light, making me look like a solid, immovable pillar of authority. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. A suffocating, absolute dead silence crashed over the hundreds of people in attendance. Up at the front table, the color instantly and violently drained from my father's face, leaving him a sickening shade of ash gray. His hand began to tremble uncontrollably. The expensive crystal wine glass slipped directly from his paralyzed fingers. It hit the solid marble floor, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces, with a sharp, explosive crash that echoed like a gunshot through the dead quiet room. Near the entrance doors, Brittany stood completely frozen. Her jaw unhinged, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as she desperately tried and completely failed to form a single coherent word. The sharp crunch of shattered crystal beneath my tailored heels broke the absolute silence of the grand ballroom. I walked forward. The sea of elite investors, local politicians, and wealthy socialites instinctively parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly to the stage. They did not know my name, but they recognized the undeniable weight of absolute authority. I kept my gaze locked on the mahogany podium. I did not look at my father. I did not need to. The suffocating wave of his sheer, paralyzing terror radiated from the front row. I ascended the wooden steps with the slow, methodical grace of a predator closing in on its trapped prey. Malik stood frozen at the center of the stage. The arrogant charisma he had wielded just moments ago had completely evaporated. His dark eyes were wide, darting frantically between my face and Harrison, who stood beside the podium like a grim sentinel. Malik opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to demand an explanation, but his vocal cords utterly failed him. His jaw worked soundlessly. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist caught the harsh glare of the stage lights, suddenly looking exactly like the cheap, fraudulent prop it truly was. Harrison stepped aside respectfully, yielding the center of the stage. He handed me the microphone with a swift, professional nod. In his other hand, he held a sleek black presentation remote. He placed it carefully into my palm. I wrapped my fingers around the smooth plastic. It felt heavy with the power to obliterate multiple lives in a single keystroke. I turned to face the massive crowd. Hundreds of pairs of eyes stared back at me wide with breathless anticipation. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the high-definition speakers, calm, glacial, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Good evening," I said. My words sliced through the heavy tension in the ballroom. "I am Savannah. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I want to thank every single one of you for attending tonight. You were invited to witness the execution of a $5 million corporate investment. You were promised a glimpse into the future of technological innovation. But Vanguard Holdings does not invest blindly. We operate on a foundation of absolute uncompromising financial transparency. Before we authorize the transfer of a single cent, we conduct a comprehensive microscopic forensic audit of our applicants." I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Malik. He was sweating profusely now. Thick beads of moisture formed on his forehead, ruining his flawless presentation. He took a stumbling step backward, instinctively trying to put distance between himself and the impending slaughter. Tonight I continued, keeping my gaze fixed on my trembling brother-in-law. We are not here to celebrate a tech visionary. We are here to conclude an audit. I raised my right hand and pressed the button on the presentation remote. The massive LED screen behind the podium flashed brilliantly. It did not display the celebratory Vanguard Holdings logo. It did not show Malik's sleek, fraudulent corporate branding. The screen instantly projected a high-resolution, unredacted 60-page financial audit report. The bright, glaring red numbers illuminated the entire stage, casting a harsh, bloody glow over Malik's tailored suit. A collective, audible gasp ripped through the ballroom. The elite investors in the front rows leaned forward, their eyes scanning the colossal digital spreadsheets. Whispers erupted like wildfire as the devastating truth was laid completely bare. I pointed to the glowing red columns on the screen. "As you can see clearly detailed on the main ledger," I announced to the horrified crowd, "the startup company we were asked to fund is nothing but a hollow shell. The proprietary software does not exist. The user acquisition metrics are entirely fabricated. The primary operating account is currently sitting at a negative balance. There is no revenue. There is no business model. There is only a highly sophisticated, incredibly desperate Ponzi scheme." I pressed the remote again. The screen transitioned to a new slide magnifying a series of international wire transfers. I directed the crowd's attention to the offshore routing numbers. I explained that the initial seed capital Malik had secured from previous unsuspecting investors had not been used to pay developers. Instead, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been systematically embezzled, routed through dummy corporations, and deposited directly into a hidden offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. The murmurs in the ballroom escalated into angry, aggressive muttering. Several prominent venture capitalists in the audience reached for their cell phones, realizing they had been sitting in a room with a federal criminal. Malik was shaking violently. He gripped the edge of the mahogany podium, his knuckles turning stark white as his legs threatened to give out completely. I was not finished. I had saved the most personal, devastating piece of evidence for the grand finale. I pressed the remote one final time. The massive screen shifted. The complex financial spreadsheets vanished. In their place, blown up to a towering 20-foot display, in flawless high definition, was the crumpled, textured paper I had retrieved from the foyer of my parents' home. It was the Cartier shopping receipt. I looked down at the VIP table. My father was clutching his chest, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. My mother sat frozen next to him, her eyes locked on the screen in absolute terror. "This," I said, my voice ringing out over the growing chaos in the hall, "is a receipt for a $40,000 diamond bracelet." It was purchased yesterday afternoon. It was not purchased for a dedicated wife. It was purchased for a mistress named Jasmine, who aggressively demanded her monthly allowance at a private family dinner. I paused, letting the sheer scandal of the revelation sink into the minds of the wealthy socialites. Then I delivered the killing blow. If you look closely at the payment method printed at the bottom of the screen, I continued, you will see that this luxury jewelry was not bought with corporate funds. It was purchased using a premium credit card belonging to Richard. In order to artificially inflate his failing company, Malik convinced his father-in-law to secretly leverage a secondary mortgage on his family estate. He drained the life savings of the very people who trusted him, and he used that stolen equity to finance his infidelity. The ballroom erupted. The sound of shouting, furious investors and scandalized guests echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Malik staggered backward, completely unmoored, his chest heaving as he desperately scanned the room for an exit that did not exist. The brilliant, charismatic chief executive persona he had so carefully crafted was entirely annihilated. Every single lie, every stolen dollar, and every pathetic illusion had been violently ripped away. He stood trembling under the harsh stage lights, utterly exposed and definitively ruined in front of hundreds of the most powerful business partners in the city. The heavy brass doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open. The chaotic shouting instantly died down as a dozen men and women in dark windbreakers marched into the hall. The bright gold letters printed across their jackets read SEC. Federal investigators had arrived. I had personally transmitted the complete forensic audit to their regional director 3 hours before the gala, providing them with offshore routing numbers, forged payroll documents, and the exact physical location of their primary target. The elite socialites shoved each other out of the way to clear a path. The investigators marched straight down the center aisle, their eyes locked on the mahogany podium. Up on the stage, the remaining blood drained from Malik. His arrogant facade evaporated. He stared at the approaching federal agents with unblinking eyes of sheer terror. His brain processed the inescapable reality. There was no corporate spin to save him. The suffocating weight of his impending federal prison sentence crashed down upon his shoulders. His knees buckled completely under the pressure. He collapsed onto the polished wooden floor, landing with a sickening thud. He curled into a pathetic, trembling ball beside the podium, gasping for air. Down in the front row, the paralyzing shock holding Brittany hostage snapped. The Cartier receipt glaring on the massive screen above finally registered in her materialistic mind. It was not just that her husband was a fraud. It was the undeniable reality that he had used her parents' stolen retirement money to shower another woman with diamonds while she bragged about buying luxury cars. A primal shriek ripped from her throat. Brittany charged up the wooden steps of the stage, abandoning any shred of high society dignity. She threw herself directly onto Malik. She began screaming hysterically, her voice cracking with pure rage. She clawed frantically at his tailored suit, tearing at his silk tie and striking his chest with her bare hands. She yelled about the mistress and screamed about the public humiliation. She demanded to know where her money was, completely oblivious that it was never her money. Harrison signaled security. 2 massive guards rushed onto the stage, physically dragging a thrashing, sobbing Brittany away from her husband. The federal agents ascended the steps, hauled Malik off the floor, read him his Miranda rights, and snapped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, right over his fake gold Rolex. While the police detained the fraudulent tech visionary, a completely different kind of desperation unfolded at the edge of the stage. My father, Richard, and my mother, Linda, watched their entire existence burn to ashes. The illusion of their elite suburban supremacy was gone forever. The realization that Malik was going to federal prison was devastating, but the horrifying comprehension of the poison pill clause I triggered was finally taking root. They realized Vanguard Holdings legally owned the deed to their sprawling estate. They had signed away their entire life savings. They were absolutely, unconditionally bankrupt. Most terrifying of all, they finally realized the discarded daughter they had left to die in a hospital bed was the absolute master of their financial universe. Richard and Linda scrambled frantically up the stage steps. Their aristocratic composure was entirely shattered. Richard stumbled, his rented tuxedo pants catching on the wooden edge. Linda was openly weeping, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in messy streaks. They did not approach me with anger. They did not try to gaslight me or pretend this was a trivial misunderstanding. They operated on pure primal desperation. They rushed forward and literally threw themselves onto the polished stage floor at my feet. My father, the man who demanded perfection and ruthlessly punished my perceived failures, fell directly onto his knees. He reached out with trembling hands, hovering just inches from the hem of my midnight blue Tom Ford gown, too terrified to actually touch the delicate fabric. He looked up at me, his face contorted in a mask of absolute panic and pathetic submission. "Savannah, please," my father begged, his voice cracking with hysterical tears. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot execute that contract. We will lose the house. We will be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing to our names. We are completely ruined. Please, Savannah, I am begging you, have mercy on us." My mother crawled forward on her knees, pressing her hands together in a desperate posture of prayer. The heavy Cartier jewelry hanging from her neck clinked loudly. The irony of her wearing the brand of jewelry Malik used to betray them was entirely lost on her. She sobbed violently, choking on her own tears as she looked up at my face. "You have to save us!" Linda cried out, her voice echoing through the microphone stand I stood next to. "We are your parents. We raised you. We gave you a solid roof over your head. You cannot let them take our home away. We made a horrible mistake, Savannah. We were just confused. But we are blood. You have to protect your blood. Please do not make us homeless. I will do anything you want. Just stop the bank from taking the house." They knelt before me, crying and shivering under the harsh white spotlight. The entire ballroom watched in dead silence as two prominent suburban socialites groveled at the feet of the daughter they had repeatedly abused and abandoned. They were begging for salvation from the exact same woman they had willingly sacrificed just a few weeks prior. They wielded the concept of family like a weapon of last resort, hoping to trigger a sense of loyalty that they themselves had systematically destroyed over 33 years. I stood perfectly rigid. The sharp, aching pain in my fractured ribs was completely silenced by the overwhelming, intoxicating rush of absolute power. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel an ounce of remorse. I looked down at the two miserable, broken people weeping pathetically at my custom heels. The corner of my mouth slowly twitched upward into a cold, razor-sharp smile. Family. The word family hung in the chilled air of the grand ballroom. I let the silence stretch, allowing the sheer hypocrisy of my father's plea to echo against the gilded walls. Richard and Linda remained on their knees, their faces upturned in desperate, pathetic prayer. They looked at me as if I were a vengeful deity, capable of reversing the absolute destruction they had brought upon themselves. They truly believed that invoking a biological connection would magically erase decades of emotional abuse and a lifetime of deliberate neglect. I slowly reached into the small clutch purse hidden within the folds of my midnight blue gown. My fingers wrapped around the smooth, cold metal of my encrypted cell phone. I pulled the device out and held it up under the harsh glare of the stage spotlight. I did not look at my parents. I turned my attention to Harrison, who stood with the rigid, impeccable posture of a high-ranking military officer waiting for a final command. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Harrison understood immediately. He stepped forward and handed me an audio integration cable connected directly into the master soundboard of the Waldorf Astoria. The technical crew in the control booth above had already authorized the override. I plugged the cable into my phone. A sharp electronic chime signaled that my personal device was now perfectly synced with the massive high-definition acoustic system of the ballroom. I looked down at the two trembling figures groveling at my feet. Then I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice remained entirely devoid of warmth, cutting through the heavy tension like a scalpel. "You want to talk about family?" I said, my words booming across the silent sea of stunned guests. You want to leverage the concept of blood to save your suburban mansion. You want these esteemed investors, these politicians, and these influential socialites to believe that you are loving, devoted parents who just made a simple financial miscalculation. You want them to pity you. You want them to look at me and think I am a cruel, vindictive daughter destroying her own flesh and blood for the sake of corporate greed. My mother let out a loud, miserable sob, reaching her hands out toward my shoes. She begged me to stop speaking. She pleaded with me to keep our private matters off the stage. I stepped back completely out of her reach. But Vanguard Holdings deals strictly in facts. I continued, my gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of the elite audience. And the fact is, the people kneeling before you do not know the meaning of the word family. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I was trapped inside a mangled vehicle. I sustained severe life-threatening injuries. My ribcage was shattered. I was rushed into an emergency trauma center, choking on my own blood while the surgical team prepared to cut open my chest to prevent my lung from collapsing. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. Wealthy women covered their mouths in shock. Prominent businessmen stared at my parents with dawning revulsion. I provided the hospital with one emergency contact, I told the crowd. I gave them the number of the man currently begging for his house. The trauma nurse called him. The nurse explicitly told him I was dying. And because the hospital records all emergency dispatches for legal compliance, I have the exact audio file of how my loving family responded to the news of my impending death. I looked down at my father. The desperation in his eyes instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated horror. He knew exactly what day I was talking about. He remembered the mimosa brunch. He remembered the live saxophone music. He remembered his own vicious words. He opened his mouth to scream, to demand that I put the phone away, but no sound came out. I pressed play on my screen. The state-of-the-art sound system of the Waldorf Astoria amplified the recording with flawless, crystal-clear precision. The audio filled the massive hall. Every single guest heard the sophisticated background noise of Le Petit Restaurant. They heard the clinking of champagne glasses and the smooth jazz playing over the patio speakers. Then they heard the panicked voice of David, the trauma nurse, pleading with my father to rush to the hospital because my oxygen levels were critically low. The entire ballroom held its breath. Then the booming, unmistakable voice of Richard echoed from the massive speakers. It was not a voice of parental panic. It was a voice of deep, venomous irritation. "Look," my father's recorded voice sneered. "She can wait. We are literally about to order our entrees." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and visceral. A wave of absolute disgust washed over the hundreds of attendees. But the audio file was not finished. The recording continued, delivering the final catastrophic blow to their social standing. "Dad, wait!" Brittany's sharp, greedy voice rang out across the silent ballroom. "If she actually dies in there, does her life insurance and savings account go to me? I really need the cash for that new Tesla." Finally, the recording captured my father's low, approving chuckle, followed by the sound of glasses clinking in a cheerful toast. The audio cut out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. I disconnected my phone. I looked out at the sea of faces. The elite society my parents had worshipped, the wealthy network they had sacrificed everything to impress, stared back at them with unmasked loathing. Politicians turned their backs. Investors shook their heads in absolute revulsion. Socialites glared down at Richard and Linda, as if they were grotesque, diseased monsters that had crawled out of a sewer. Their reputation was permanently, irreparably incinerated. They were entirely socially dead. My father slumped forward, his forehead pressing against the cold wooden floor of the stage. He wept uncontrollably, mourning the total loss of his public image. My mother covered her face with her trembling hands, her harsh sobs echoing pathetically through the microphone stand. They were utterly broken, stripped of their arrogance, their home, and their humanity. I looked down at them one last time. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but the profound, liberating weight of absolute closure. The debt had been paid in full. I uncurled my fingers and let the microphone slip from my grasp. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the polished wood with a loud, violent thud that reverberated like a gunshot through the grand hall. I turned my back on the wreckage of my former family. I walked toward the stage stairs with perfect, unyielding posture. In the background, the sharp metallic click of police handcuffs snapping securely around Malik's wrists provided the ultimate soundtrack to my departure. 6 months have evaporated since that night at the Waldorf Astoria. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Malik stood in a federal courtroom, stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his heavy gold Rolex. The judge did not care about his aggressive corporate jargon or his fabricated pitch decks. The evidence Vanguard Holdings provided to the Securities and Exchange Commission was absolutely bulletproof. During the trial, Malik tried to spin his usual web of lies, but my legal team presented the offshore routing numbers, the fake payroll documents, and his own digital signature on the poison pill contract. Malik was found guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 84 months in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The fake tech visionary was reduced to an inmate number locked away in a concrete cell far away from the luxury restaurants and offshore bank accounts he so desperately craved. He now spends his days performing menial prison labor, earning pennies an hour, a fitting reality for a man who tried to steal millions. Brittany filed for divorce the absolute second the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, but severing the legal tie did not save her from the financial blast radius. She quickly discovered that her entire identity was built on stolen equity and maxed out credit lines. The bank aggressively repossessed her luxury vehicles right out of the driveway in broad daylight. Every single platinum credit card in her designer wallet was brutally declined and permanently canceled. The high-end boutique managers who used to greet her with complimentary champagne now threatened to call security if she showed up begging for store credit. Stripped of her fraudulent wealth, Brittany faced the terrifying reality of an empty bank account and zero marketable skills. The golden child who had openly plotted to use my life insurance payout to fund a new Tesla was forced into the only job that would hire her. She now wears a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform, standing for 8 punishing hours a day behind the cash register of a discount supermarket. She has to scan expired coupons for the exact same working-class people she spent her entire life mocking and treating like absolute garbage. Her hands, once adorned with expensive manicures and stolen diamonds, are now cracked and blistered from handling dirty cash and bagging cheap groceries. Her days are defined by aching feet and the profound, suffocating humiliation of public failure. But the most absolute devastating destruction was reserved for Richard and Linda. The poison pill clause I had embedded in the Vanguard funding contract executed with terrifying mechanical precision. The second Malik signed that digital document, he authorized the total liquidation of his collateral. My parents had foolishly tied the deed of their sprawling suburban estate to his fraudulent enterprise. Vanguard Holdings did not hesitate. My legal team initiated the foreclosure process the very next morning. There were no negotiations. There were no extensions or tearful appeals to the bank. The eviction notice was taped directly to their heavy oak front door by the local sheriff. Richard and Linda were forced to stand on the sidewalk and watch as corporate liquidators marched into their home, seizing their expensive furniture, their imported art, and the Cartier jewelry bought with stolen money. The neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress stood on their manicured lawns, watching the humiliating spectacle with undisguised judgment. The high society friends they had sacrificed everything to impress vanished instantly. The country club revoked their membership due to unpaid dues. Their social circle treated them like a highly contagious disease, refusing to return their desperate phone calls or offer them a single dime of charity. They lost every ounce of their fabricated honor and their stolen wealth in a matter of days. With their retirement funds completely drained by Malik, and their credit scores entirely annihilated. My parents had nowhere left to go. The affluent suburbanites were aggressively pushed out of their gated community. They were forced to rent a tiny, decaying one-bedroom apartment in a dangerous, dilapidated slum on the absolute worst side of the city. The walls of their new home are lined with black mold. The heating system barely functions, leaving them shivering through the cold nights. The people who once complained that my near-death experience was ruining their mimosa brunch now have to navigate dark, crime-ridden stairwells just to reach a stained mattress on the floor. They jump at the sound of police sirens and sleep with the deadbolt locked, terrified of their own neighborhood. They are experiencing the exact brutal reality of survival that they once forced me to endure when they threw me out to protect their perfect image. I watched their entire empire burn to ashes from the absolute safety of my corporate penthouse. I sat behind my massive glass desk on the top floor of the Vanguard Holdings Tower, reviewing the final liquidation reports. The financial analysts confirmed that the debt had been collected and the assets successfully absorbed. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt or remorse. I felt only the clean, sterile satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. The universe had simply corrected a massive 33-year-long accounting error. I had not destroyed them. I had merely handed them the exact consequences of their own monstrous greed. My secure cell phone suddenly buzzed against the polished glass of my desk, breaking the quiet focus of my office. I picked up the device and looked at the bright screen. It was an incoming text message from an unsaved number, but the desperate, groveling tone of the words was unmistakably familiar. The message was from Richard. The text read, "Savannah, your mother and I are starving. We have not eaten in 2 days. Please, I am begging you, save us." I stared at the glaring text message illuminating the dark glass of my executive desk. Richard was begging me for survival. He was using the exact same pathetic tone he had once used to demand my blind obedience. I looked up from the glowing screen and let my gaze sweep across the breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. My penthouse office at Vanguard Holdings sat 80 floors above the bustling streets. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed an empire that I had built entirely with my own 2 hands. I was completely surrounded by the quiet hum of immense, untouchable power. Down below, somewhere in the miserable, rotting slums of this sprawling metropolis, the people who shared my DNA were currently shivering in a mold-infested apartment. They were finally experiencing the exact level of desperation they had so casually sentenced me to endure. I did not feel a single ounce of obligation. I did not feel the slightest twinge of daughterly guilt. The societal expectation that children must blindly forgive their abusive parents simply because of biological ties was a toxic lie that I had completely eradicated from my mind. Richard and Linda had never been parents to me. They had been wardens. They had been leeches. Now they were just another pair of bankrupt strangers begging for a handout from a billionaire they had actively tried to destroy. I picked up my secure corporate cell phone. The metallic casing felt cool and heavy in my palm. I opened the text thread. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph explaining my justification. I did not hurl insults or demand apologies. True power does not require an explanation. True power operates with absolute terrifying brevity. I tapped the digital keyboard with slow, methodical precision. I crafted my final message to the man who had once laughed at the prospect of my death. "You can wait. I am ordering my entree." I hit send. The small notification confirmed the message had been successfully delivered to his prepaid disposable phone. I did not wait to see if the typing bubble would appear. I did not care what his pathetic response would be. I immediately tapped the settings icon in the top right corner of the contact profile. I selected the option to block the caller. A secondary prompt asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to permanently restrict this number. I pressed confirm with the unwavering certainty of a judge delivering a final verdict. The digital connection was instantly severed. Richard and Linda were completely, irrevocably erased from my entire existence. A soft, respectful knock at the heavy mahogany door of my office broke the absolute silence. The door swung open smoothly. David stepped into the spacious executive suite. He was no longer wearing the wrinkled, blood-stained blue scrubs from the emergency room trauma center. He was no longer the exhausted, overworked nurse fighting a broken healthcare system. David was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and possessed an aura of quiet, humble confidence. He looked exactly like the brilliant, capable medical professional he was destined to become. I stood up from my glass desk and walked over to the private wet bar situated near the corner window. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter and poured a generous measure of premium aged bourbon into 2 heavy tumbler glasses. David walked across the plush carpet and stood beside me looking out over the sprawling city landscape. He let out a long, incredulous breath, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He told me he had just finalized the paperwork with the university administration office. He said the Vanguard Holdings Medical Scholarship Fund had officially cleared every single financial hurdle. His entire medical school tuition had been paid in full up front, without a single string attached. Furthermore, the fund guaranteed a generous living stipend that would cover his housing and expenses for the entire duration of his demanding surgical residency. He turned to look at me, his eyes shining with profound, overwhelming gratitude. He said he had spent his entire life working double shifts just to barely scrape by. He told me he never thought he would actually achieve his dream of becoming a licensed trauma surgeon. He tried to thank me again, his voice thick with raw emotion. I handed him one of the crystal glasses. I told him he did not owe me a single word of thanks. I reminded him of the dark, freezing night in the emergency room when my own flesh and blood had abandoned me to die. I told him that while my family was busy planning how to spend my life insurance payout, he was the only person who actually fought to keep me breathing. He had risked his own career and his medical license to access that dispatch recording simply because he believed in basic human decency. I raised my glass, the amber liquid catching the light from the setting sun outside the massive windows. I told David that Vanguard Holdings heavily invests in people who demonstrate absolute integrity under extreme pressure. I said funding his medical degree was not an act of charity. It was the smartest, most profitable investment I had ever made. David smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up his entire face. He raised his glass to meet mine. The heavy crystal tumblers clinked together with a sharp, resonant chime that echoed perfectly through the quiet penthouse office. We drank to new beginnings, to unrelenting justice, and to a future entirely free from the chains of toxic manipulation. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty and kindness do. Have you ever had to cut off toxic people who called themselves family? Share your story in the comments below. The profound lesson hidden within this journey is that sharing DNA does not automatically guarantee love, loyalty, or basic human respect. Society often conditions us to believe that we must endlessly forgive our toxic relatives simply because they are our parents or siblings. We are taught to endure emotional abuse, constant manipulation, and severe neglect in the name of keeping the family together. But the truth is that biological ties are merely an accident of birth. They are not a lifetime contract for indentured emotional servitude. When you finally realize that the people who are supposed to protect you are actually the ones holding you underwater, you face a terrifying but ultimately liberating choice. You can either continue to drown in their expectations, or you can cut the anchor and swim to the surface. Choosing to walk away from toxic relatives is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of fundamental survival and profound courage. Establishing absolute, uncompromising boundaries is the highest form of self-respect you can ever practice. You do not owe your success, your peace, or your financial resources to people who only value you for what they can extract from you. True family is never defined by a shared last name or a matching bloodline. True family is built entirely on consistent actions and unwavering support. It is found in the people who show up for you during your darkest, most terrifying hours. It is found in the strangers who offer pure compassion when your own relatives offer nothing but cruelty and greed. When you finally stop wasting your energy trying to earn the validation of people who are committed to destroying you, you create the space to build a life of genuine peace. You become the architect of your own reality, surrounded only by those who recognize and celebrate your true value. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? And if so, how did you build your chosen family? Share your story with us in the comments below.